We are currently at Spring Hill Cemetery in Huntington, West Virginia. You can see it just out the window there. Juliet Enslow. She was a Huntington socialite. She had a little wealth but married into a lot of wealth. It is said that her husband at the time of her death was one of the richest people in Huntington, perhaps the first millionaire here. They had and owned a huge mansion. She lived there after her husband's death, so rich that they had maid service. So it was such a shock when one of the maids opened the door and found Miss Enslow laying in bed, beat to death.
Forgotten by time, lives ended by the hand of someone else in cold blood. We finish their stories because they were not able to finish their own. You're watching Vintage Murder, a Whit Docs series. She was born into wealth, a member of the affluent in a time and in a place where such wealth was not common. Juliet Buffington was born on March 9, 1873, to Peter Klein Buffington and her mother Louisa. Mr. Buffington was the first mayor of the city of Huntington, West Virginia, so growing up, all Juliet knew was being wealthy and came from a family and a situation that afforded her the opportunity to live such a life. She would become a socialite in its purest form, and that socialite status and lifestyle would be carried throughout her life. She married Charles Baldwin in 1892, but unfortunately he would pass away less than 10 years after their marriage. Now enter to our story, Frank Bliss Enslow. If it is said that Juliet Buffington was wealthy before, the marriage to Frank Enslow would solidify her as one of the wealthiest people in Huntington. Frank Enslow was thought to be one of, if not the richest person in Huntington, and was influential throughout all of West Virginia. In addition to his business dealings, which included being a lawyer and the president of the Huntington National Bank, he owned a large amount of properties. His prominence and wealth afforded him the ability to build a mansion that is still talked about to this day, known as the Enslow Mansion. This extravagant property boasted 26 rooms and was built in an area that was referred to as Millionaire's Row, and for good reason. The whole neighborhood was full of rich and wealthy people. And in the early 1900s, the Enslow Mansion was the center and the very epitome of social life in Huntington, West Virginia. With its silk wallpapers, stained glass windows, and even marble fireplaces, the Enslow Mansion transcended Millionaire's Row. Frank Enslow would pass away in 1917, making Juliet Buffington Enslow the sole owner of the property, and she would most definitely keep up the social aspect of the home. As famous as the mansion was, and as well known as the landmark of Millionaire's Row stood out in the community, in 1936, the mansion would gain vast amounts of notoriety for all the wrong reasons. The Enslow Mansion and wealth continued long after the death of Frank Enslow. It was very well known at just how wealthy and connected that Juliet Buffington Enslow still was at the time. She would continue to be known as a socialite. The mansion still operated with the same extravagance as always. The house and property was still so vast that Juliet Enslow would still employ maid services to take care of the property. And one of those maids would discover the gruesome scene, a scene so heinous that it captured the attention of an entire city. It was morning, October 17, 1936. A maid, making her rounds and performing her tasks, would open the door to the room of Juliet Buffington Enslow, and what she found would be a most gruesome and inhumane discovery: the lifeless body of Juliet Enslow. The body showed signs of severe and brutal trauma. She had been beaten, possibly strangled, and stabbed multiple times with what appeared to be an ice pick. An investigation of homicide would begin immediately. There were 2 diamond rings that were stolen. Enslow had no known enemies. There was no one who would have wanted to inflict pain and suffering on Juliet Enslow. With no enemies and no known feuds, investigators would try to piece together a suspect and a motive. What would a motive be in a case such as this? On the surface, there was no motive, unless you looked just a little deeper. And you didn't have to look far. You didn't have to look far for a suspect, especially if that suspect believed that he would be set to inherit a vast amount of wealth should Juliet Enslow pass away. Living in the mansion at the time was the son of Juliet Enslow, Charles Baldwin. Not only did the community feel that Baldwin was behind all of this, the police did too, and they felt that they had enough evidence to make the arrest. And 10 days after the brutal discovery, he was arrested on March 27th. The charge? Murder. So the police had a suspect and a good case that they had the perpetrator of this crime. Baldwin would go to court in the latter part of 1937. After a trial and a deliberation by a jury, the verdict was given. We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty. Not guilty. Undoubtedly, this verdict would have shocked the community, especially because of the widespread belief that Charles Baldwin had committed the crime. It all made perfect sense, but something about the case and the suspect didn't do enough to compel a jury to make the guilty verdict. And most of the time in this series, we find a story, a motive, a suspect, and a guilty verdict. This time, and in this case, we do not. As a matter of fact, this murder and this case is still considered unsolved. A few things to go over. One of the diamond rings was actually found in 1940. Some thought that this would prompt a new investigation into the case. It did not. The mansion was sold to a local funeral director who converted it into a funeral home in 1937. It is said that it was sold due to the dark cloud that hung over it because of the murder. The mansion would burn in 1977, and it is said that a car lot now occupies the former location of the mansion. This story was a truly sad and a crazy one to tell, and for the first time in our series, we end in an unsolved case. Another tragic and terrible story. Another story from a time gone by. Another vintage murder. Forgotten by time. Lives ended by the hand of someone else in cold blood. We finished their stories because they were not able to finish their own. You're watching Vintage Murder, a Whit Docs series.